Hey everyone, welcome back to Noiseberry Games. So I've just finished my first playthrough of the Elden Ring DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree. I did a video on my first, I think, 2.5 hours, and said I would do a follow-up video once I finished it. I've now finished it, so I'm going to talk about some of my thoughts about the DLC. I'm going to try and keep this still fairly vague. I'm going to mention like a couple of bosses by name, if they're not like impactful. Like if I say the name Gaius, for example, people who know the DLC know what that is. If you don't, it doesn't really mean anything. But if there's any big spoilers, I'm not going to be talking about them. I'm going to try and be fairly vague because, the DLC's only been out for just over a week at this point. So my first playthrough of the DLC, it took me 35 hours. I played on my character Cheeky, who used the Death's Poker build. Fantastic weapon, especially for the base game. Definitely didn't work as well in the DLC, and I did think it was potentially a little bit of a weird character to take into the DLC because it's specifically built around this one weapon. And so I was thinking, all these weapons I'm going to find in the DLC, I'm not going to be able to use. And if you don't know, Death's Poker is a weapon, a great sword that does Ghost Flame damage, and it scales off int and a bit of dex. And I think in the last about third of the game, I found a katana that also scales off mostly int and a bit of dex. And I ended up putting that in my secondary first weapon slot. So I would have Death's Poker in my right hand, and then I would switch to the katana also in my right hand. And it was just very good to, have something faster I could switch to when the Death's Poker was a bit too slow. So, I didn't think I would actually be able to use any new weapons I found, and then I was able to. So that was very cool. I was glad I was able to use a new weapon. But anyway, yes, I spent 35 hours in the DLC, and I'm so much more mixed on this DLC than I ever expected to be. The base game, Elden Ring, I've said it before, is now my favorite game of all time. I've played it for, as of today, 443 hours, which is probably not a lot compared to some people, but it's easily the most played game in my Steam library. I've got 7 characters. I've done, I think, 4 randomizer playthroughs on top of those 7 characters. But I've got 7 legit game characters that I've played through. My playtime in the base game ranges from, I think 80 hours was the longest, to 16 hours is the shortest I've done it in now. And the base game wasn't perfect. The base game had a couple of issues, but nothing major, I would say, and it's not enough to stop it from being my favorite game of all time. It was my game of the year when it came out. But I am very mixed on the DLC. I guess overall feelings, I did really enjoy it. I enjoyed it enough to play it for 35 hours. I blitzed through, I think 24 hours of that was the first weekend it released. It was all I did was play the DLC. And when I knew I was getting to the end of my first DLC playthrough, I was feeling really, I don't know, kind of a bit upset because I didn't want it to end, because I was mostly enjoying it. I was really enjoying riding around some of these beautiful vistas and exploring and poking around for things. And I was kind of looking for more things to do before I went down the final path to the end of the game. So I think ultimately, yeah, I think I did enjoy it. I think I'm fairly positive on it. But there are some things in this DLC that really do bring it down. And I can see why it was at mixed reviews for a while on Steam. Recently it's gone back up to mostly positive. But I think a lot of the criticism of this DLC is well-founded. So I think the 3 biggest things that bring this DLC down for me are, first is performance. Performance is absolutely dreadful. If I play the regular game, anywhere in there except for Lich Dragon Fortisax always brings my frames down for some reason. But anywhere in the base game, 60 FPS, no problem. I'm on a NVIDIA 3080. I got that, I bought that graphics card pretty much just for Elden Ring. But the DLC struggles to hit 60. I think it's probably below 60 most of the time. Not much below 60, but like if I toggle the frame rate counter on just like in a random area, it's probably at like 55 to 58 or something. Not the end of the world, but kind of weird after the base game was nice and locked at 60. But there are absolutely areas in the DLC where it drops down to mid 40s. It's usually in the big open areas when like a ton of geometry is loaded on the map. The DLC is very vertical, so if you kind of go up to a cliff edge and you look down, you're probably going to see another area that you can eventually get to. And I think they've probably just like loaded too much of that in, because especially in those areas where you're like looking down on something else, your frame rate is usually around in the mid 40s. But there was one dungeon which was, very internal, not much should have been loaded. And I was at like 40 FPS in most of the dungeon. There's just some very, very strange performance issues in the DLC. And it does still have the shader compilation issues. Like the very first time I entered the first area, I was down at like 40 FPS. Right before recording this video, I had a little bit of time when I was drinking my morning coffee, and I didn't want to start recording yet, so I started my second DLC playthrough, and I got to that same area. No stutters there. It was not at 40 FPS. It's because my PC has cached the shaders for that area. So in the DLC, this was an issue with the base game. Whenever you see a texture or something for the first time, it struggles to cache it, I guess, and that leads to very poor performance. But then once you see it again, the performance won't be an issue. But these were issues that were in the base game back in, when did it come out? 2022, I think? Yeah, like February 2022. Never addressed, never patched, and still there in the DLC. And the biggest performance issue does actually come in the final boss fight. Not going to go into any particulars here, but one of the attacks in the final boss fight legitimately drops you down to 20 FPS. It is shocking. There is not a computer, a console, a system in the world that will be able to run this boss fight at a locked 60 FPS. Not a chance. Not a system in the world that will do it. And I just cannot believe they play tested this and thought, yep, that's good enough. This is a third of the FPS that people are used to. Ship it. It's fine. Just absurd. I cannot believe they thought that was okay to release. And then a couple of days ago, they put out, I think like a couple of days after the game came out, or after the DLC came out, they put out a post saying, make sure that your RTX settings are turned off, because that can be tied to poor performance. And of course it's off. I don't run RTX in most games because I would rather prioritize frame rate. And I think some people said that RTX had been toggled back on after an update. Mine hadn't. RTX has never been on, so that's not the culprit behind the performance issues. And then a couple of days ago, they made another post about the PC performance, and they said, oh, it's probably tied to external mouse software. You should probably disable that. I don't have any external mouse software or anything. I think it's got to be such a niche scenario. I think it's for people who use it to rebind their mouse keys for games or something. A tiny percentage of the PC player base must use that. And for some reason they're like, yeah, this is probably it for the performance issues. Again, not a chance. They're just not working properly on the performance issues, and I don't know why. The second major factor that makes me very mixed on the DLC is tied to performance. When the DLC was getting close to being released, Miyazaki said it was roughly the size of Limgrave. Slight spoilers, it's bigger than Limgrave. I won't say much more than that, but it is quite large, which was sometimes an issue in the base game. Sometimes I think people consider Lyrinia to be quite a large but ultimately fairly empty area. Mountaintops, for example, is a lot of just riding through it because there's not a ton to do there. That is multiplied in the DLC. It's so large. There are lots of areas, lots of big open areas, but some of them feel like there's even less to do. I mean, there is less to do in a lot of these areas than the base game. There are some of the most beautiful locations you'll ever see in a video game in this DLC, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. You will be blown away if you take the time to explore and blindly come across some of these locations. You will be blown away at how nice they look. But then, some of them, there's just nothing to do in them. In the base game, it felt like if you poked around, if you turned a corner, you'd find a cave or something, or catacombs. And there were a lot of repeated dungeons in the base game, absolutely. But there was still something to do. And a lot of the areas in the DLC, there's really nothing to do. And it really sucks because the thing I loved the most about the base game on my first playthrough and why I spent 80 hours in it was very methodically exploring it and really poking around, trying to find these little hidden caves and grottos and stuff, and finding a cool item at the end of a little catacombs. And so I instantly went back to doing that very methodical exploration, and there was a lot of times when there was just nothing to find, and that was very disappointing. And I think it's definitely going to speed up my subsequent playthroughs, because I'm going to know as soon as I hit this one area, I know I just kind of ride from point A to point B, because I know there's nothing between them. There's literally nothing to find. And I guess kind of tied to exploration is a lot of the loot you find is extremely uninspired. There is, new weapons, new weapon types, new armor sets. But it really feels like probably 7 times out of 10, if you find a glowing item on the ground, you pick it up, it's going to be something ridiculously boring. It's going to be a very basic crafting item, like a mushroom. It's going to be a smithing stone that you don't need at this point. For context, to get to the DLC, you have to beat Mohg and Radahn. Mohg is considered quite a late game boss in the base game. Right outside of Mohg is the top tier somber upgrade material, which is to get a somber weapon to +10. But in the DLC, you're finding a lot of smithing stone 4 to 6s, really. And it's very strange, because by this point, you almost certainly have the bell bearings that allow you to buy unlimited of these smithing stones. And if you don't, it's very easy to head back into the base game and find it. So you really don't need that many upgrade materials. They're just kind of, it always feels bad to have done, a tiny little dungeon or something, and you just find a smithing stone at the end. Not great loot, or a mushroom or something. It's quite disappointing. And the final thing that brings the DLC down for me is a lot of the bosses. There were some really cool bosses in the DLC. I think a couple of my favorites were ones that people either didn't like or people just don't mention. Probably my favorite boss of the DLC, I was looking through a thread on the Elden Ring subreddit yesterday about people's favorite boss. Literally didn't see it in the comments, and it is my favorite boss, which is quite funny. So there are absolutely some good bosses in the DLC. There are also some dreadful ones. I think there's probably the 2 worst bosses FromSoft has ever designed in the DLC. That does include Bed of Chaos. I think I would absolutely rather fight Bed of Chaos than a couple of the bosses in this DLC. Even though it's crap and poorly designed, that's just how bad some of the bosses are in the DLC. You quite regularly hear that, or I've seen at least, that a lot of bosses in Elden Ring are designed around you summoning spirit ashes. They're in the game, they're quite encouraged to be used, and a lot of the bosses are kind of intended to be fought with you and a little NPC partner, which makes it all the more baffling that many bosses in the DLC just bum rush you as soon as you walk through the fog gate. There are several of them, I think. I can think of at least 4 right now. There are probably more. But basically the idea in the base game was you do your buffs outside the fog gate, you walk through the fog gate, and then you summon probably Mimic Tier or whatever Spirit Ash you're using as soon as you're in. But in the DLC, you buff outside, you walk through the fog gate, the boss is on top of you already, and there's a lot of times where you just don't have the opportunity to summon your Spirit Ashes, which is very weird because it does feel like you're intended to use them, but then you're often punished for trying to use them in the DLC. A lot of the bosses also play kind of too aggressively, I guess. Most of them do these huge, multi-part combos that you just have to dodge. You can't attack during those attacks. You just dodge a bunch, they finish, you get off one attack, and then they start up another combo. And there's been a couple of very funny memes and posts about this recently. One of them I saw was very funny, and it really spoke to me, and it's literally just been like echoing around my head the whole time I've been doing the DLC. It's like, you start the boss fight, it's the boss's turn, the boss spends 12 seconds doing a huge multi-part combo, you dodge the whole time, the boss finishes the combo, it's now your turn. You do one R1 attack, your turn is over. It's now the boss's turn. The boss spends another 10 seconds doing a multi-chain combo attack. You get hit during this attack, it's now your turn. You heal, your turn is over. And it rings so true, because there are so many bosses where you literally just dodge for 10 seconds straight, you get off one attack, and then you have to dodge again. It's not fun. There's a lot of bosses in the DLC that I did not think were fun because of this. And the final boss, again, I'm not going to go into too many details, but the final boss is the worst for this whole issue of not letting you attack. I don't want to talk too much about the final boss, but it is absolutely dreadful. I had to respec my character to a cheese build just to get past the final boss. I tried for, I think it was probably about 3 hours on my regular Death's Poker / new weapon build. Throughout the DLC, I actually ended up using like the invisibility sorceries. Night Comet especially was really, really strong. So I tried using Death's Poker, I tried using the new Int Katana, I tried using my spells. Just nothing I could do would get past this boss. And that is the first time I've ever had to respec in Elden Ring to get past a boss. Even Millennia, I remember I had one character that just could not do Millennia. I was stuck on her for 3 days, but I refused to respec. I just kept trying at it, and I kept summoning people, and eventually we got past it. And Millennia always felt doable, even on this character that really, really struggled against her. It always felt like I could do it. This final boss, it felt like I had no chance of doing it, or I had to get extremely lucky, and I just didn't want to bash my head against this boss for 3 days. It's not fun to fight. It's a miserable experience overall. For Millennia, I always felt comfortable summoning people because I felt like I could always, I wouldn't be a hindrance to whoever I summoned. I could kind of hold my own against Millennia. I didn't want to try summoning another player against this final boss because it just felt like if I died, it wasn't really down to me. It was just down to the boss being absolute bullshit. And honestly, the final boss was so bad that I literally don't see myself fighting it again unless they nerf it. I'm gonna do more DLC playthroughs. I've got a couple of fun builds I'd like to try out, but they're all gonna stop at the final boss unless it gets nerfed. I'm happy I managed to get past it once, even though I had to completely respec to a cheese build. But if they don't nerf the final boss, I'm never gonna fight it again because it's horrible, not fun to fight, and complete bullshit. So I understand I just kind of ranted about my negative thoughts about the DLC for a while. Like I said, I'm quite mixed. I really liked a lot of it. Like I said, I did not want it to end, but there are things in the DLC that really bring it down for me. But having said that, I spent 35 hours in it on my first character. I beat the final boss, respect back to my proper cheeky desk poker build, and then logged into another character so I could start the DLC again right away. And I'm looking forward to playing through it and trying this new build that I've gotten a good idea for. I guess one more thing I should talk about is the Erdtree blessings. These are the key items that you find in the DLC, and they, if you use them at a grace, they power you up, but only in the DLC. And they're essential for the DLC. If you're not getting them, if you're not using them, you're gonna struggle. And something I learned fairly recently was if you get summoned into somebody else's world, because I tried to help people with bosses a fair bit in the DLC. If you get summoned into someone else's world, you take on their DLC power level, basically. And when you get summoned, you can check your status screen, and it'll tell you what the host's power level is. And I don't think I ever got summoned to somebody's world who had even the same power level as me. Everybody was always well below my power level, because in order to upgrade your power level, you have to find these items out in the world. And there are a lot of them, and there are no superfluous fragments, I guess. In the base game, you have to collect golden seeds to upgrade your Estus flasks. And there are more golden seeds than you need, so you don't have to very thoroughly find the exact same seeds every time. You can kind of pick which ones work well for your exploration path. In the DLC, you need every single fragment in order to max your power level, and I actually didn't even max my power level. I ended up one below max because I missed some of them throughout my exploration because I did a blind playthrough. I didn't look up where anything was. And when I did look up a list of where these fragments were, I had no idea which ones, I'd got and which ones I didn't. So I ended up not maxing out the power level because it was just going to be far too tedious to go to every single spot on the map and try and figure out if I'd got that one or not. So it's just a weird way of upgrading in the DLC, I guess. It was kind of compared to Sekiro before it came out, and Sekiro you power up from beating bosses, and that would have made sense if you got if there were 10 of these DLC items and you had to kill specific bosses to power up. That would kind of make sense. Some of them are tied to bosses, but the vast majority are just kind of scattered throughout the world. Sometimes in clear locations, like there's a couple of times you'll find a church, and they'll just be under a statue. That kind of makes sense. Sometimes they're literally just in a random corner, and it's not a very fun system for upgrading, just having to explore and find some quite random locations. There was one time when I was quite late in the game, and I was helping people co-op my favorite boss because I quite liked fighting it. And I got summoned into someone's world, and at this point I was always checking my status screen to see how strong or how weak the host was. And normally they'd be at around half the max level, I'd say. Anything above that was good. Anything a bit below that was always going to be a bit of a struggle. And one time I got summoned, and their power level was 0. For context, you need to find one fragment in order to get to level 1. They had been going through the DLC with no DLC power levels. And I was like, this is going to be a disaster, but I've got to see what happens. And so I went into the boss room. I took one hit, and it did 95% of my health. Whereas I think if I'd fought that boss in my world, I would probably take about 30%. So I just separated out instantly because, we were going to do no damage to the boss, and we were going to take a ton of damage ourselves. But yeah, it's very weird that you can have such varying power levels just because these weird fragments are scattered throughout the DLC, and you need so many of them in order to get good power levels. Okay, this video's gone a lot longer than I was expecting. I obviously had a lot to say about the DLC. I've been kind of sitting on these thoughts for the last week, and I've known that I needed to probably get a bit of it off my chest, because, yeah, I wasn't expecting to be as mixed on the DLC. Overall, I do like it, and obviously I like it enough to instantly go back into another playthrough. But there are a surprising number of issues in the DLC, some of which can be fixed, some of which can't. Yeah. Let me know your thoughts on the DLC. Let me know if you've started it yet, or if you're still holding off on it. Definitely keep the comments as spoiler-free as I've kept this video. I actually ended up keeping it very, very spoiler-free. I think some of the things I've talked about, people who have played will know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, then there won't be anything here that spoils the DLC for you. Thank you guys very much for watching. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!